She is his first wife.
I really didn't know then. I thought my father handled it.
My husband's side chick turned out to be his secret first wife. 4 years into my marriage, I sat in a Sharia court registry in Kano and listened to a clerk read a document that turned me, in the space of a single sentence, into a woman who had never legally been married at all. If you have ever built a life around a man, only to discover the ground beneath that life was never solid to begin with, you already know the particular kind of grief that has no name in any language I speak. Stay with me till the end, because the woman I spent 2 years hating as my husband's side chick was, it turned out, the one telling the truth from the very beginning. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because this story does not end the way either of us expected it to. My name is Halima. I met my husband Aliyu 7 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding in Kaduna, where he was one of the groomsmen, and I was seated at a table close enough to the high table to notice him noticing me. He was at the time 30 years old, running a modest but growing transport and logistics business he had inherited the foundations of from his father, a respected businessman named Alhaji Sule, who had built relationships across 3 states over 4 decades of trading. Ali was charming in the unhurried, confident way of a man who has never had to work very hard to be liked, and I will admit, honestly, that I fell for him faster than I usually allow myself to fall for anyone. I remember the first time he called me, 2 days after that wedding, having gotten my number from the mutual friend whose celebration had brought us together in the first place. He did not open with the usual empty compliments most young men offered in those calls. He asked me instead about the small business I ran at the time, a modest fabric and tailoring shop I had built up slowly over 3 years. And he asked such specific, genuinely curious questions about supplier relationships and seasonal demand that I found myself talking for almost 40 minutes before I realized how much time had passed. I told my sister afterward that I had met a man who actually listened, and she laughed and told me to be careful, that men who listen well in the beginning sometimes do it because they have practiced listening as a way of getting exactly what they want. I did not take her warning seriously enough at the time. I have thought about it often since. We courted for 8 months, married in a ceremony that filled 2 full compounds with guests from both our families, and settled into a large house on the outskirts of Kano that Alhaji Sule had gifted us as a wedding present, generous in the way wealthy patriarchs often are when a beloved son finally marries. I remember walking through that house for the first time as its mistress, admiring the spacious kitchen, the well-tended garden Alhaji Sule's own gardener maintained, and feeling for the first time in my adult life that I had arrived somewhere permanent and safe. For 3 years, our marriage felt to me like something close to a fairy tale, or as close as any marriage gets once the early glow settles into the ordinary rhythms of shared life. Aliyu was attentive, generous, present in the ways that mattered, home for dinner most nights, patient with my mother when she visited for extended stretches, quietly proud of me in front of his own family in a way that even his more critical aunt softened toward me over time. We had one daughter, Fatima, now 3 years old, a bright, stubborn little girl who had inherited her father's easy laugh and, unfortunately for both of us, his father's temper as well. I think back now on those 3 years and search them for signs I might have missed, the way you comb through old photographs after a diagnosis, looking for symptoms hidden in the ordinary frames of a life that seemed at the time entirely unremarkable. I do not find much. Aliyu traveled occasionally for the business, as any man in transport and logistics does, but nothing that struck me then as unusual or suspicious. He was affectionate with Fatima from the moment she was born, took genuine joy in small domestic routines, Sunday mornings making her breakfast himself while I slept a little later, evenings reading to her in a voice that made her giggle uncontrollably. If a man was carrying a secret that large during those years, he carried it so lightly that I never once felt its weight pressing against the life we were building together. That, more than anything else, is what still unsettles me when I look back. Not that he lied exactly, since he genuinely did not know the truth himself, but that an entire foundation could be this unstable and still hold a family's weight so convincingly for so long. It was near the start of our 4th year of marriage that things began to shift, quietly at first, in the way most betrayals begin, not with a dramatic reveal, but with small absences that accumulate until one day you realize you've been living inside a slow erosion for months without naming it. If you love stories where the person everyone tells you to hate turns out to be the one who never lied to you, this is exactly that story. And I promise you, the truth waiting underneath it will surprise you as much as it surprised me, because for 2 years, I directed every ounce of my anger at a woman who had far less power in this situation than I ever imagined. The rumor started with my husband's driver, a young man named Yusuf, who had worked for Aliyu's transport business for years and who mentioned almost in passing to one of my sisters at a family gathering that Oga's madam, meaning me, since I was the only wife he had ever driven anywhere, had been asking about a woman who sometimes rode with Aliyu on his trips to Zaria. My sister, alarmed on my behalf, brought this to me immediately, though I had in fact asked Yusuf no such question, which meant someone else entirely had been asking and using my name to do it, a detail that unsettled me more than the rumor itself. I confronted Aliyu directly, the way I have always preferred to handle conflict rather than letting suspicion fester in silence. I remember the exact evening, Fatima already asleep, the two of us sitting on the veranda where we usually had our most honest conversations, the smell of the neem tree Alhaji Sule had planted years before either of us moved in drifting in on the evening breeze. I laid the rumor out plainly, watching his face carefully the way you learn to watch a husband's face once suspicion has entered a marriage even slightly.
He denied everything at first, with the particular calm confidence of a man who has had practice denying things, though I did not yet know at that point how much practice he actually had. He told me Yusuf had misunderstood a business associate for something else entirely, that I was allowing gossip to poison a marriage that had given me no real reason for doubt in 3 good years together. He reached for my hand across the small table between us, and I remember how easily I let him take it, how quickly the warmth of his palm against mine dissolved most of my suspicion, at least for that particular evening. I wanted, desperately, to believe him. I did believe him, in fact, for almost another full year, choosing the comfort of his explanation over the discomfort of continuing to dig. But the small things kept accumulating. A phone that began staying face down on every surface it touched. Trips to Zaria that grew more frequent, always described vaguely as business. Always scheduled, I began to notice, around specific dates each month that had no obvious relationship to any business cycle I understood. A new caution in the way he spoke on calls when I was in the room, stepping outside for conversations he had once, in our early years, been perfectly comfortable having in front of me. He started coming home from those Zaria trips quieter than usual, a distracted heaviness settling over him for a day or two afterward that he explained away as exhaustion from the road, an explanation I accepted for longer than I now think a wiser woman would have. I began, quietly, to investigate, the way any wife in my position eventually does once denial stops feeling like a safe place to live. I found her name first, Sadiya, through a receipt I discovered in the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner, a receipt for a modest guest house in Zaria, dated the previous weekend, made out not to Aliyu's business account but to his personal name, alongside a second name I did not recognize. I stood in our bedroom holding that small, ordinary piece of paper, the kind of receipt you'd normally crumple and throw away without a second thought, and felt my entire chest tighten around a name I had never once heard my husband mention in 7 years of knowing him. I sat with that receipt in my hands for almost an hour before I could make myself move, running my thumb over the printed letters of her name as though repetition would somehow make the discovery less real. If your chest is tightening the way mine did, stay with me, because the story Sadiya turned out to be living inside was far more complicated and far less half-fulled than anything I imagined in that terrible hour holding a stranger's name in my hands. I hired someone, a quiet, careful woman named Hajia Rakia, who did discreet investigative work for wives across Kano who found themselves in situations like mine. Work that exists in a kind of unofficial economy built entirely on referrals and whispered recommendations between women who have all, at some point, needed exactly this kind of help. I met her first in a small office above a pharmacy, uncertain at that point whether I was about to confirm the worst thing I could imagine or discover a far more ordinary explanation for a business receipt with an unfamiliar name attached to it. She was calm in a way that steadied me immediately, taking notes in a small notebook without once making me feel foolish for the details I offered her, the dates, the guest house, the specific quality of Aliyu's silences in the days following each Zaria trip. It took her 6 weeks to build a full picture of who Sadiya actually was, and what she found rearranged everything I believed about my own marriage, my husband, and the woman I had already, in my mind, cast as the villain of my own story. Those 6 weeks were their own particular agony, waiting for updates that arrived slowly in careful fragments, each one deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. First, Sadiya's full name and approximate age, then her family's connection to Zaria's cattle trade, then finally the detail that upended everything I thought I understood. A marriage certificate 11 years old, bearing both her name and my husband's. Sadiya turned out to be not a mistress in the way I had imagined, not a younger woman drawn in by a wealthy man's charm, not a calculating opportunist chasing another family's money. She was 34 years old, the same age as Aliyu, and she had been married to him first in a formal Islamic ceremony conducted 11 years ago when both of them were young and their families were close business partners, a marriage arranged in the traditional way by Alhaji Sule and Sadiya's own father, a respected cattle trader in Zaria whose family had done business with mine for 2 generations. The marriage, according to everything Hajia Rakia was able to confirm, lasted just under 2 years, and it was, by every account she gathered, deeply unhappy. Aliyu's mother, a formidable woman I had, admittedly, always found somewhat difficult myself, though I had never experienced anything close to what Sadiya apparently endured as a much younger bride with far less standing in the family, had treated her new daughter-in-law with a coldness that escalated over those 2 years into something closer to cruelty, according to 2 former household staff Hajia Rakia managed to locate and speak with. One of them, a cook who worked for the family during that period and had since retired to a village outside Zaria, described Sadiya as a quiet, gentle young woman who had arrived in the household eager to please and had been within months reduced to eating her meals alone in her room rather than face another evening of her mother-in-law's sharp remarks at the family table. Sadiya left eventually, returning to her family in Zaria, unable to bear a household that had made her feel unwelcome from her first week inside it. I found myself reading these details in Hajia Rakia's careful typed report, an unexpected kinship with a woman I had spent months privately resenting. I too had encountered Aliyu's sharp edges, though age and circumstance and perhaps simple luck had spared me the full force of what Sadiya apparently endured as a much younger bride with far less standing in the family. It was strange, sitting in my own kitchen reading about another woman's suffering at the hands of the same family that had on the whole been kind to me, and feeling something shift in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. Not quite sympathy, not yet, but the first small crack in the anger I had been carrying towards her for months. Here is where the story stopped being a simple tale of an unhappy young marriage and became something else entirely, something that would eventually unravel my own life alongside hers. Sadiya and Aliyu never formally divorced. If you're still with me, subscribe now, because what I discovered next explained not just a rumor about a side chick, but 4 years of a marriage that legally may never have existed at all.
Under Islamic law, a marriage of that kind requires a formal pronouncement of divorce, properly documented, before either party is free to remarry. Aliyu had always believed, he would later insist, that this process had been completed years earlier, handled quietly by his father, Alhaji Sule, in the aftermath of Sadiya's departure, the way older patriarchs of that generation often handled delicate family matters without involving their adult children in every uncomfortable detail. He told me, once everything finally came out, that he had simply assumed the paperwork existed somewhere, filed away with the rest of his father's business and family records, and had never once thought to verify it himself, trusting a father he had never before had reason to doubt. What Hajara Kia eventually uncovered through a contact inside the Sharia court registry was that no such divorce had ever been formally recorded. Alhaji Sule, it turned out, had indeed intervened after Sadiya's departure, not to finalize a divorce, but to quietly negotiate a private arrangement with Sadiya's father. An arrangement designed to preserve a business partnership both patriarchs valued far more than either of their children's individual happiness. Sadiya's family had for years held significant debt with Alhaji Sule's transport business, debt tied to a series of cattle hauling contracts that had gone badly during a difficult season, contracts that had left Sadiya's father owing sums large enough to threaten the entire herd if called in abruptly. The quiet understanding between the two men, never fully explained to either Aliyu or Sadiya, was that the marriage would remain technically, legally intact, unspoken and unresolved. A kind of insurance policy protecting the business relationship between two families while both young people were simply allowed to drift apart in practice without either family losing face over a public divorce and without Alhaji Sule ever having to formally call in a debt that could have ruined a family he still, in his own way, considered close to his own. I imagine, though I will never know for certain, that Alhaji Sule told himself across those 11 years that he was protecting everyone involved. His son from an unhappy marriage, Sadiya's family from a debt they could not easily repay, the broader business relationship both households had spent decades building. What he never seemed to consider, or perhaps considered and dismissed as an acceptable cost, was what would happen if either of his own children ever tried to build a new life on top of a marriage that never actually ended. It was Sadiya's father's death, 18 months before I discovered any of this, that finally set the whole unraveling in motion. With her father gone and the business debt largely resolved through a settlement his estate negotiated separately, Sadiya reached out to Alhaji Sule directly, asking for the first time in over a decade for the divorce to be formally completed so she could move forward with her own life. She had, by then, met someone new, a widowed school teacher in Zaria who wanted to marry her properly, and she needed documentation she had every reason to believe already existed. I have since learned, through pieces Aliyu shared with me during the long, difficult conversations that followed, exactly how that reveal unfolded on his end, and it has made me, over time, somewhat gentler toward him than I might otherwise have been. Alhaji Sule called Aliyu into his study one evening, the same study where years earlier he had once explained to Aliyu the basics of the family transport business, and told him, with none of the ceremony that news deserved, that the divorce he believed had been finalized over a decade ago had in fact never been recorded, and that Sadiya was now pursuing the matter through the courts. Aliyu learned, 4 years into his marriage to me, with a 2-year-old daughter already at home, that he had never actually been free to marry me at all. He told me, once everything finally came into the open, that his first instinct that night was to drive straight home and tell me everything immediately, and that it was fear, not calculation, that stopped him. Fear of watching our daughter's world dissolve over a mistake that was never his to begin with. Fear, most of all, of a truth so strange that he worried I might not even believe him without documentation in hand to prove it. He spent the following months, he explained, trying to move quickly enough through the legal process to bring me an answer, rather than only a devastating question. A decision I understood intellectually, as it left me for 2 years suspecting an affair that was never actually happening.
The trips to Zaria, the guest house receipts, the secretive phone calls, none of it I would eventually understand was an affair in the way I had imagined it. It was my husband, quietly, desperately, trying to finalize a divorce he had only just learned was never completed. Meeting with Sadiya and later with lawyers and court officials, trying to resolve a crisis he had not created but was now entirely responsible for untangling. All while too ashamed and too frightened of what it would do to our marriage to tell me the truth before he had a solution in hand. The guest house itself, it turned out, was simply the most practical, discreet place for two people with a complicated shared history to meet and walk through legal paperwork without word spreading through a community where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business within days. Sadiya later told me during our long conversation at the cafe that those meetings had been almost unbearably awkward for her too. Two people who had once been unhappily married as teenagers, sitting across a small table a decade later, filling out forms and discussing legal timelines with the stiff formality of strangers conducting business. Both of them acutely aware of how catastrophic the whole situation had become for people neither of them had ever intended to hurt. If your heart is heavy the way mine was, understand that I do not tell you this to excuse him fully. His silence cost me 2 years of suspicion, of feeling like I was losing my mind over a phone that stayed face down, of directing my anger and hurt at an innocent woman I had never even met. But I understood, finally, that the villain in this story was never Sadiya, and was perhaps not even fully Aliyu, but a generation of men who believed certain truths were theirs to manage on behalf of everyone else, regardless of the devastation that management would eventually cause. Subscribe now if this story has held you this long, because what happened once the truth finally reached the court registry was not the ending any of us were prepared for. The formal divorce between Aliyu and Sadiya was completed within 3 weeks of Alhaji Sole's confession, a straightforward legal process once both parties finally understood what needed to happen and agreed, with something close to relief, to simply resolve it. But the completion of that divorce created an entirely new problem, one that Hajiara Kia had warned me about from the earliest days of her investigation, but that I had not fully allowed myself to absorb until I was sitting in the Sharia court registry myself, listening to a clerk explain it in plain, unhurried language. My own marriage to Aliyu, conducted while he was still legally married to Sadiya, had never been valid under Islamic law. Not troubled, not complicated, simply, legally, never valid at all. 4 years of a life I had built, a wedding 2 compounds had celebrated, a house I had decorated room by room, a daughter I had carried and raised believing her parents' marriage rested on solid legal ground. None of it had the standing I believed it had, and the annulment, once the truth was fully documented, happened with a swiftness that still, months later, leaves me faintly breathless when I think about it. I remember the registry room itself with an almost painful clarity, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, the stack of files on the clerk's desk, the particular indifferent efficiency with which he read through the relevant sections of law, as though he processed cases like mine every week and had long since stopped feeling the weight each one carried for the woman sitting across from him. Aliyu sat beside me throughout, his hand reaching for mine at one point, though I remember pulling it back, not out of anger at that specific moment, but because I could not yet bear to be touched while listening to a stranger explain, in flat legal language, that the last 4 years of my life had a different name in the eyes of the law than the one I had always used for them myself. One court appearance, One reading of the facts, a marriage of 4 years dissolved not through any fault or failure of my own, but through a decision two men made 11 years before I ever met either of their sons. A decision I had no part in and no knowledge of until it reached out across more than a decade to quietly unmake my entire life. I met Sadiya for the first time 3 weeks after the annulment, not by accident, but because I asked to. I do not fully know what I expected walking into that meeting. Perhaps anger or the strange competitive grief of two women who had unknowingly shared the same man. I chose a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Kano, neutral ground for both of us, and arrived early enough to sit alone for 10 minutes, rehearsing sentences I ended up not needing once she actually walked through the door. She was smaller than I had somehow imagined her, soft-spoken, with the particular careful posture of a woman who has spent years learning to take up as little space as possible in rooms that once made her feel unwelcome. What I found instead of the confrontation I had braced myself for was a woman as devastated by this discovery as I was, in her own entirely different way. She had spent over a decade believing herself free, had built a new relationship with a man that deserved an honest partner, and had discovered in the same terrible unraveling that upended my life that her own engagement now had to be paused indefinitely while the legal record of her actual marital history was finally corrected. We sat together for almost 2 hours in that quiet cafe. Two women who had every reason on paper to hate each other, instead comparing the specific shape of a betrayal that in the end had been committed against both of us equally by the same two men. She told me about the cold years in that household, years that I had only read about secondhand in Hajirakia's report, and hearing them in her own voice, watching her hands tremble slightly around a teacup she never finished, made the whole story feel suddenly and unbearably real in a way the typed pages never had. I always wondered, she told me at one point, stirring a cup of tea she never finished, why he never remarried in all those years before you. Now I understand. He believed, the same as I did, that there was nothing standing in his way. We were both lied to by the same silence. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe, because the ending I can offer you is honest rather than tidy, and I think by now you understand why I no longer trust easy endings at all. Aliyu and I did not simply remarry once the legal confusion was resolved, though many people in both our families assumed once Sadiya's divorce was finalized and my own marriage's annulment properly documented, that this was merely a formality to be corrected as quickly and quietly as possible so the family's reputation could return to normal. I could not move that quickly, not because I no longer loved him, but because 4 years of my life had just been declared by a legal system neither of us controlled to have never actually existed in the way I believed it had, and I needed time to understand what that meant for me before I could agree to walk back into the same arrangement without any real changes beneath it. I moved with Fatima to my mother's house in Kaduna for 4 months, a separation Aliyu did not fight, though he called every single day and drove the 2 hours between our cities most weekends, sitting outside my mother's gate sometimes for an hour before I felt ready to let him in. Those 4 months were their own strange kind of grief, not quite mourning a marriage since Aliyu had not died and had not in any way that mattered to me by then betrayed me on purpose, but mourning instead a version of my own life that I had believed was solid and discovered was not. My mother, to her credit, never once pushed me toward a decision in either direction, simply making space for me to sit with my own confusion for as long as I needed to, cooking my favorite meals from childhood and asking gently only whether I had slept, never whether I had decided anything yet. Alhaji Sule, for his part, attempted an apology I have still not fully found the capacity to accept, an apology that felt, even in the moment he offered it, more concerned with restoring the family's standing than with reckoning honestly with what his decade of silence had actually cost two women who trusted the men in their lives to tell them the truth. He came to my mother's house himself, uninvited, during my second month there, sitting stiffly in our modest sitting room in a way that made clear how unaccustomed he was to being on the requesting end of any conversation. He spoke of family honor, of difficult decisions made for the good of everyone involved, of an old man's regret at how things had unfolded, and I listened politely, the way you listen to an elder even when every word he offers falls short of the thing you actually need to hear, and I said very little in return, because I had not yet found the words myself for everything I wanted him to understand about what his silence had cost. We did eventually remarry, properly this time, in a small ceremony that felt nothing like the celebration of 4 years earlier. No 2 full compounds of guests, no elaborate festivities, just close family and a quiet, sober awareness on both our parts that a marriage rebuilt on top of a broken foundation requires more honesty going forward than either of us had practiced before. I remember standing beside Aliyu during that small, quiet ceremony, both of us older in a way that had nothing to do with the years that had actually passed, and thinking about how strange it was to feel more solemn at his second wedding to the same man than I had at our first elaborate one, as though we had both, finally, understood what a marriage actually required of 2 people in a way our younger, more naive selves had never had cause to learn. Aliyu is different with me now, more transparent in ways both large and small, sharing details of his business dealings and his family conversations with a completeness that sometimes feels almost excessive, as though he is trying deliberately to prove he will never again let a silence like that one grow between us. He has taken to reviewing important documents with me now at our dining table, a habit that would have struck me strange in our earlier marriage, walking me through contracts and family matters he once would have handled entirely on his own, as though transparency itself has become a kind of penance he is still working through. I believe him, mostly. I am also, I will admit honestly, a woman who checks a phone left face down on a table more often than I once did, a habit I am not proud of but have not yet found the strength to fully release. He has never once complained about it, understanding, I think, that trust rebuilt after this particular kind of rupture arrives slowly in small installments rather than all at once. Sadiya married her school teacher 8 months later, once her own paperwork was finally settled. I attended the wedding, an invitation that surprised even me when it arrived, and one I nearly declined before deciding that a woman who had shown me nothing but honesty deserved my presence rather than my continued distance. I remember standing near the back of the celebration, watching her laugh freely in a way I imagined the young bride in that first unhappy marriage 11 years earlier had rarely been permitted to, and feeling something in my chest ease slightly, a small unexpected gladness that at least one thread of this tangled story had found its way towards something clean and whole. We are not close friends, not exactly, but we message each other occasionally, 2 women bound together forever by a story neither of us chose, checking in on each other's lives with the particular gentleness of people who understand, better than almost anyone else could, exactly what the other one survived. I think often about Alhaji Sule's decade of silence, about how easily 2 grown men decided on behalf of 2 women neither of them thought to consult, what truth was safe enough to withhold, and what damage was acceptable in service of a business arrangement that in the end resolved itself within weeks once it was finally forced into the open. I think about how much of what we call fate in a marriage is actually just other people's choices made quietly years before we ever arrive to inherit their consequences. Fatima is old enough now to ask occasionally why she has cousins in Zaria she has never met, referring to a side of Sadiya's extended family our 2 households have slowly, cautiously begun to acknowledge as connected through this strange shared history. And I find myself giving her answers simpler than the truth, promising the fuller version when she is old enough to hold its weight, the way I eventually had to. If there is anything I want you to take from this story, it is that the person you have been taught to see as the villain is not always the one who deceived you. Sometimes she has been surviving the very same silence you have on the opposite side of a lie neither of you were ever given the chance to refuse. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the silences hiding in your own family's history, subscribe and stay close, because I have more of these true stories to tell. about the quiet decisions other people make that eventually reach across the years to reshape our own lives without warning. Until the next one, ask the hard questions early. Trust the woman standing on the other side of your suspicion before you assume the worst of her, and never let anyone else's comfort be the reason your own truth stays buried.